Hello, Connecting Point. Welcome back to our study through the life of David. This week we're going to be reading from 2 Samuel 16 verse 15 through 2 Samuel 17 verse 23. And we're in the middle of this story of Absalom's attempted coup. And we're going to be actually zeroing in on two characters this week who are neither Absalom nor David. So we look forward to that. As a bit of a preamble, I just wanted to share a couple reflections that'll hopefully frame what we're going to talk about today. One of the things that has really stuck out to me in the last couple years of Bible study, especially thinking about the Bible as being this book of meditation literature. It's a book that invites us to think carefully and deeply about the ideas that it's bringing up, and it invites reflection. It changes us through that reflection. One of the ideas that's key to this is found in the first Psalm. Now, the Psalms, the first two Psalms, they establish the entire arc of what the rest of the Psalms are going to talk about, and I think they're actually really fundamental to understanding what wisdom literature is trying to do. So Psalm 1 talks about this idea of the one who loves the law of the Lord is blessed, but not so the wicked, right? The second psalm then describes how the Lord is going to judge the nations according to their love of the law. And that work of judgment is going to be done by this promised king on a holy hill of Zion. And that's, of course, pointing towards Christ, towards Jesus and the work he does in judging the world at the cross and then in rising from the dead. This thought interests me because it really puts you into one of two camps as the reader. Am I a person who loves the law of the Lord, or am I a person who is not loving the law of the Lord enough? And it really lays out two paths for human life. But the other thought that interests me is this notion that I brought up early on when we were going through 1 Samuel still, that the characters that we encounter in the biblical stories and the people that we meet in our day-to-day lives are not protagonists or antagonists. They're agonists. They're strugglers, right? That word, it's a Greek word, agon, means contest. So you can think about the Olympics or something like that, or struggle, right? It's not a morally charged term in and of itself, an agonist. It's just someone who's not always doing it right and not always doing it wrong. But I think this accurately describes everyone who isn't Jesus of Nazareth. We all struggle. We struggle with sin. We're not inherently righteous or purely evil. You see this enacted in the world around you. Even people who do a lot of bad will have elements of their character that might be virtuous, right? Even people who are quite saintly can suffer from pretty devastating sinful tendencies. So I think these two ideas need to be held in tension. This idea that there is one way that is a good way, and there is another way that is a bad way. And also, we sit in the middle, and we struggle with those two poles in our lives. One's ultimate place as saint or sinner is not inherent. It doesn't come through one's actions. Remember that all of us have sinned and fall short of God's glory. But it's through responding rightly to God. Loving the law of the Lord, loving his justice, loving when we're corrected, because that gets us back on the correct path. We become more correctly oriented to God when we love his law, when we follow his plan and his purpose. Our righteousness is not the source of our righteousness. God's grace is the source of our righteousness, but we can still reap the benefits from living righteously. On the other hand, we become disoriented when we allow other things to creep into God's rightful place in our lives. As Nicole described it last week, our sin acts like this rock that gets dropped into the middle of the water, and when we repent, God pulls that rock out, making it just as if we'd never sinned. But the ripples of it still go through all kinds of lives, our own and the other people around us, and it can still cause quite a lot of pain and turmoil. This week, what we're going to be looking at as we look at this story of David is a story that really interacts with this concept of humans as strugglers, the presence of moral grayness in the world, and we're hopefully going to see that God's plan and purposes go forward because He is faithful to His word. We're going to see that some of these guys are responding rightly to God, and some of them are not, and that all of this is going to be enacted in the political and military planning within Absalom's camp during Absalom's coup attempt. So, to start with, I'm going to give you one more bit of preamble to do, and it's in the form of a table talk. Here's the table talk. I want you to actually go and read Psalm 33, and then just at your tables share one verse or observation that stuck out to you from reading this psalm. Okay, let's quickly recall where we left off our story. David has escaped Jerusalem, but only just in front of Absalom. Absalom has won the hearts of the people, but David has sent a couple of his own people back into the city to act as something like double agents. These were the priests, Zadok and Abiathar, and then their sons, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, as well as this fascinating character, Hushai, who we're going to be taking a lot of time with today. So let's read chapter 16, verse 15, and we're going to read all the way down to chapter 17, verse 23. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. And then Hushai the Archite, David's confidant, went to Absalom and said to him, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" Absalom said to Hushai, "So this is the love you show your friend? If he's your friend, why didn't you go with him?" Hushai said to Absalom, "No, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people, and by all the men of Israel. His I will be, and I will remain with him. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve the son? Just as I served your father, so I will serve you." Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give us your advice. What should we do?" Ahithophel answered, "Sleep with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. And then all of Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be more resolute." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he slept with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now in those days the advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. Ahithophel said to Absalom, "I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he is weary and weak. I would strike him with terror. And then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed." And this plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. But Absalom said, "Well, summon also Hushai the Archite, so we can hear what he has to say as well." And when Hushai came to him, Absalom said, "Ahithophel has given this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion." Hushai replied to Absalom, "The advice Ahithophel has given is not good this time. You know your father and his men. They are fighters, and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops. Even now, he is hidden in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say, 'There's been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom.' Then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear, for all Israel knows that your father is a fighter and that those with him are brave. So I advise you, let all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you, with you yourself leading them into battle. And then we will attack him wherever he may be found, and we will fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it down to the valley until not so much as a pebble is left." Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel." For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar the priests, "Ahithophel has advised Absalom and the elders of Israel to do such and such, but I've advised them to do so and so. Now send a message at once and tell David, Do not spend the night at the fords in the wilderness. Cross over without fail, or the king and all the people with him will be swallowed up. Jonathan and Ahimaaz were staying at En-Rogel. A female servant was to go and inform them, and they were to go and tell King David, for they could not risk being seen entering the city. But a young man saw them and told Absalom. So the two of them left at once and went to the house of a man in Bahurim. He had a well in his courtyard, and they climbed down into it. His wife took a covering and spread it out over the opening of the well and scattered grain over it. No one knew anything about it. When Absalom's men came to the woman at the house, they asked, "Where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan?" The woman answered them, "They crossed over the brook." The men searched but found no one, and so they returned to Jerusalem. After they had gone, the two climbed out of the well and went to inform King David. They said to him, "Set out and cross the river at once. Ahithophel has advised such and such against you." So David and all the people with him set out and crossed the Jordan. By daybreak no one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey, and he set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order, and then he hanged himself. And so he died and was buried in his father's tomb. That's quite a sequence of scenes we get here. I want to come back to talking about these two rival kings, Absalom and David, at the end, because the text focuses largely on these two advisors, Ahithophel and Hushai. Now, Ahithophel was likely the grandfather of Bathsheba. We don't get a ton of information about his motivation or emotion in our text today, but presumably he might still be harboring something of a grudge against David for the treatment of his grandson-in-law, Uriah. What we do see about his character is largely found at the end of chapter 16. Ahithophel's counsel is treated with a ton of honor by David, back when David was in charge and running things, and now by Absalom, who's following Ahithophel's morally repugnant but politically canny advice to publicly take David's concubines for himself. If indeed Ahithophel was a relation of Bathsheba, then I think there's something really poetic about him causing the judgment of Nathan to be enacted by David's vindictive son. There's a lot of rich irony going on in the scene here. The rooftop that is mentioned is, probably the same one from which David had first seen Bathsheba. The tent that's pitched on top implies that there was a privacy for the actions taking place inside. But the publicity of the parade of these women into Absalom was part of the political design of the whole scene there, right? Ahithophel has deliberately gone and undermined David's authority, and Absalom is the agent of this whole thing, right? We see that Ahithophel is very obviously juxtaposed with Hushai. Hushai had been described by David as a physical liability. Back up in chapter 15, verses 33 and 34, David says to him, "If you go with me," when David's escaping out of Jerusalem, "you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'Your Majesty, I will be your servant. I was your father's servant in the past. Now I will be your servant,' then you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice." David knows who the danger is, right? Ahithophel is this clever, wise counselor. So David sends Hushai back to the court because Hushai is not physically capable, but mentally, evidently, he's quite capable. We don't get, though, the same praise for Hushai's wisdom as we do for Ahithophel's in the text. What we do see is that Hushai seems to have been quite a clever rhetorician. Look at the subtlety with which he answers Absalom's questions about his loyalty at the beginning of the section. His answers are really vague. They leave the reader seeing the deeper loyalty that Hushai has to David, right? He pledges allegiance to the Lord's anointed, right? And we see all of that kind of taking place, that there's this like double meaning in the words of Hushai. But Hushai still convinces Absalom successfully that his loyalty is now going to be with Absalom. Hushai is unable to dissuade Absalom from following through on Ahithophel's advice to sleep with David's concubines, which of course we mentioned last week that that was this fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy. But Hushai further proves his excellence in rhetoric in the advice that he gives to stop Ahithophel's war strategy, the follow-up, from being enacted. Now, another piece of juxtaposition here between the two is that Ahithophel is quite direct with all of his advice and his actions that he does in the story that we read today. In chapter 17, Ahithophel advises this immediate direct attack against David with the men that are at hand in Jerusalem. It's designed as a decapitation attack, right? All we need to do is kill the head of their movement, the king, David. And if we can do that, everyone else is going to come back to you, Absalom. Ahithophel sees rightly that only David needs to die for the rebellion to be a success. The rest of the people will get in line behind Absalom. Ahithophel even kind of volunteers to lead these men that Absalom has at hand in Jerusalem with him to go and take care of this decapitation mission himself. But Hushai just mucks it all up. He starts by praising Ahithophel. His advice is not good this time, right? Like there's this kind of pandering tone to that. And then he undercuts exactly what Ahithophel has said. And he also butters up Absalom with the way he approaches giving the next bits of advice, right? Hushai's advice is to forego a quick strike and to put out a general call for warriors to come to Absalom's service so that they can all go out and deal with David and all of David's men, right? Hushai mischaracterizes David's forces at this point. Remember last week, Nicole pointed out that it's predominantly the household that flees with David, minus those 10 concubines. And it's not all fighting men, right? Absalom has the larger army, likely a more effective fighting force if the two forces are brought to bear equally right now. However, what David does have on his side is a legend, right? David is a legend in Israel, and this legend is evidently still strong in Israel and with Absalom, right? Hushai appeals to a bunch of images that are kind of callbacks to David's story, if you will, right? He calls David and his men bears, like the one that David had killed, when he was a shepherd boy. He alludes to David hiding in caves. He's not going to be with his troops. He's going to be hiding somewhere to get a jump on you, right? Just like he did with Saul, right? He doesn't say all of it, right? But there's all these allusions that are happening. At one point, he calls Absalom's men lion-hearted. Lion-hearted, like the lion that David killed when he was a shepherd, right? Like there's all of these things that are happening. They make David sound like a more formidable opponent than he really was at this point. All of this is designed just to buy David some time to get him out of reach of Absalom and to be able to consolidate his forces and to work towards whatever resolution is going to happen. We're going to see that in the week upcoming. Note that after this discussion, Hushai isn't sure that Absalom's going to follow the advice that he gives him, to put out a general conscription call. And so he still feels the need to send word out to the priest's sons, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, in order to get David to get further away. Cross the river. Don't be caught on the west bank of the Jordan here. Hushai is hedging wherever possible, and he's very cannily playing the hand that has been dealt him in this inner working of the court politics. It is interesting to me to see that Ahithophel is a more honest and straightforward person than Hushai, and Hushai's doing a lot of lying in this text. However, one is clearly supposed to be seen as the good guy and one is the bad guy, and Hushai turns out to be the good guy. The key verse is chapter 17, verse 14, where we see that God's hand is behind Hushai's advice and Hushai's success, and therefore also David's success in this sequence. So I want to give you another quick table talk before we move forward towards our closing section. So here it is. Which do you see as most responsible for the outcome we see in this story? Is it human action or divine providence? I really enjoyed one of the commentators who was pointing out that the Bible does something far more interesting than what our two natural inclinations are when we read the stories of the Old Testament. One, our kind of first temptation when we read stories of history or something like this is to view them in this materialistic, positivistic kind of a way. David succeeds because David is a manipulator, and Hushai manipulates the situation. It's human action, human power, human cunning that can be measured with science and with logistics and with philosophy that governs human affairs, right, and human political history. But the Bible doesn't let us get away with this materialistic, human-focused perspective. the flip side of that, the other temptation, is to read it with this like romanticized supernaturalism. God acts directly and visibly, and everything is done because God is doing it all. But the Bible doesn't let us get away with this either. The reality is far more interesting and dynamic and interplayed. God is acting through history. Hushai is an operator for God's purposes. God's purposes aren't dependent on Hushai. Nonetheless, they are enacted, right? Hushai could have chosen to do differently. God's will still would have been done, but it would have been through some other human, right? There's this storytelling technique is good, and it shows this true understanding of the universe, that God is in charge and humans have agency, that we're built to be God's image. So I want to give you a quote from a book that I'm reading, which is working, part of what this one chapter was doing is working at reconciling the value of the science, the scientific kind of worldview with the material reality, with a further understanding that materialism isn't correct, right? The material reality that we see around us, the world that we measure through science, through physics, through mathematics, that's not the only reality that we're dealing with. So he gets into talking about quantum physics. And there's this notion in quantum physics that particles can be anywhere until they're measured. And humans interacting with them, it's not, I'm butchering the explanation a little bit, but they're indeterminate until the human measures them. And then we've measured it. And so it has this, it's unclear what's exactly going on until someone observes. It's an interesting phenomenon. It's called the Copenhagen interpretation. So here's his quote. The universe of the Copenhagen interpretation looks very much like the work of a God who invites us to participate with him in making the world, the kind of a God who would make the animals, but call upon Adam to consummate their creation by giving them names. Reality is outside of us, and it cannot be whatever we want it to be. But it is also designed, from the photons to the planets, as a book for us to read. And books are just letters on a page until they meet with the kind of mind for which they are written. This thought makes sense of a story like the story of David, where we see God's word and work coming to fruition. We praise David for being a man after the heart of God, but we also hold David culpable and accountable for the wrong he's done. God is the hero. Human is the one who's struggling to get in line with God. But God doesn't just flatten a human like a steamroller, right? God is working with the human being in the story, and he intends it to be that way. Furthermore, we see ourselves struggling with this same truth, that we are responsible for how we go about our struggle with God. Let's quickly turn our attention back to the two main characters in the story and see how they go about struggling before we end with the last tabletop. I want you to think about Absalom for a second. Absalom is led astray in his strategy by Hushai, and I think there's kind of two possible reasons for this. One is his insecurity, and two might be his violence. Though Absalom decidedly has the upper hand, he overestimates his father's abilities and is unwilling to press home the attack immediately. Absalom has carried off an incredible achievement, but at this point he's out of his depth. He's never been the king before. He might also find Hushai's suggestion to carry out a more general slaughter of his potential enemies appealing. Absalom might assume that there was still more loyalty to David among the people, even with the great success that Absalom had experienced there. Whatever the actual cause for Absalom's strategic failure at this point, like within his own mind, I think what we're really seeing is that Absalom is not moored by a principle aside from his own aggrandizement. You can think back to his vengeance on Amnon. I think that was probably correct on some level, right? Amnon deserved punishment. But the judgment that Absalom enacts does not seem to have been driven by righteousness alone. The same might be said for Ahithophel, his advisor here. He evidently doesn't have fundamental principles to which he feels beholden. He's been an effective strategist, but his counsel is the cleverness of a man, maybe even merely the cleverness of a man. Proverbs 21:30-31 is enacted in this moment where we see Absalom and Ahithophel and the clever devices that they're trying to use to take over this kingdom. Here's how those verses go. There is no wisdom, no insight, no plan that can succeed against the Lord. The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but victory rests with the Lord. Hushai, on the other hand, is driven by virtuous friendship, loyalty to David. And we're going to see that over the next couple chapters that David still is God's chosen king, and that there is good reason for this. Consistently in David's story, what we see is that David's heart is soft to what God is doing, and that David is not concerned just with acting in politically motivated or interested ways, but David is truly concerned with acting justly and righteously. There has been an incredible miscarriage of justice within David's life as he goes and performs adultery and murder in the whole Bathsheba and Uriah story. There continues to be miscarriage of justice in David's life as he fails to come down on Amnon for Amnon's evil with Absalom's sister Tamar. And now we're seeing the horrific fruit of all of this miscarriage of justice being reaped as David was unwilling and unable to deal with his evil sons, Amnon and then now Absalom. Amnon didn't get away with it though, and Absalom won't either, and that's what we're going to be looking at as we continue forward in our study. So to close, I want you to take another look at another of David's psalms, and this is where you really see David's heart being expressed. It's not within the text of 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's a little less clear what's going on exactly there, but when you get into reading David's psalms, what you see is the heart of a man who is, doesn't do everything perfectly, but he is concerned to grow and to do his best. And even when he fails, he casts himself upon God's moral understanding of the universe and upon God's love and grace. This psalm doesn't necessarily fall within the time frame of the Absalom rebellion. This is Psalm 20 that we're going to be reading. But the themes and ideas are still very on topic. And I think it will be worthwhile to read this. So I also want you to pray through it. I want you to maybe take a moment to share if any of the ideas that are presented in it are particularly meaningful to you today. And you can go back and refer to Psalm 33 if you're wanting to as well. But here's the final table talk. Read and pray through Psalm 20. Share if anything stands out as particularly applicable or meaningful to you today.